Being a king or a queen, being a monarch with absolute power must be a terribly difficult job. Because when you have that sort of a system of organizing humans and governing humans, the monarch is the head of everything. You are in charge of the government, you are in charge of the economy, you are in charge of the courts or the judging, however all of those things happen. All of that falls to you. There are no checks and balances. You are the final stop. You are the end. You are the answerer of all. Everyone reports to you. And I've been thinking a fair bit about how you become a king or a queen. And best as I can tell, there are two ways. And all of this came from my observations of two different things. One being the United Kingdom and the British royal family, and the other being the books and the TV show Game of Thrones. So these are very authoritative background research I have done here. So to begin with, I've always been a little bit fascinated by the royal family. Not the scandals and all of the rest of it, but anytime there's a wedding or a funeral, there's all of this pomp and circumstance, and I find myself digging into Wikipedia and just looking back at the centuries-long connections of the monarchy. So you can look at the queen and her father, and then you just keep working your way back, and there's uncles and fathers and sons and daughters, and all of them connected, all of them related. And then it's not just that one kingdom, right? Because if you're going to protect your kingdom, sometimes it's wise to marry into other kingdoms to keep them on your side as allies. So then there's all this kind of intermingling, and I just find all of that fascinating. But what it tells you is that one way to become the king or the queen is to be born into it. And when you are born into it, they spend all of their energies raising you up to be the king or the queen someday, so that you know how to do it. So they teach you the policy things you need to know. They teach you about the military. They teach you all of this stuff so that when the monarch dies and you step into that place, you can be the king or the queen because that's just who you are, because you spent your entire life preparing for it. Now, the British monarch now is more of a constitutional monarchy. It doesn't have all the power, right? So you have to think back to the time when if the king died or the queen died and now a new one comes in, they are the power. Now, if they have been prepared well and that's just who they are, they can step into that role and fill it. But there are times when the monarch died too young. And so you had a kid who wasn't quite ready yet. Or a young adult who was ready in age but not ready in wisdom. And sometimes those didn't work out so good because it wasn't who they were to be that person in the monarch. Sometimes, even though they were young, they grew into it and they became that person so that it was just who they were to be that king or that queen. Now, Game of Thrones is a whole different thing. It's a fictional story about a fictional place. And in that fictional story, there was at some point a collection of little kingdoms that were all brought together under a dynasty. And then a guy came along and got his allies together, and they wiped out, they fought the whole dynasty, and then he became the king. So he was not born into it. He took it. Well, how did he take it? He was tough, he was strong, he could lead an army, he was politically astute enough to make the connections he needed and the allies he needed to make that happen. He was mean enough to be able to watch his own back and take out the people that might want to take him out, right? And so sometimes you're not born into it, you just take it. Well, if you just take it, you still have to have some charisma and some ability and all of the things that make you into that monarch. So it just has to kind of be who you are at the beginning. I'm mindful of family businesses. I know a guy who inherited a business from his dad. His grandfather started. So he was growing up and he worked in the business. He learned all the parts of the business. By the time his dad said, "This is your business," he knew how to run it because it was just who he was. He'd been doing it for so long. But it wasn't who his kids were. They didn't want it. And they didn't want to learn how to do it. And so eventually he had to sell it because they could not live into that role the same way that he had. So you can become the monarch by being born into it and raised into it, that it becomes just who you are. Or you have some gifts and abilities that allow you to take it because that's just who you are. But in either case, you are now the monarch and you have all the power. And you also have the wealth. Have you ever seen a poor monarch? No, right? This is when you watch the royal family. They have multiple palaces, and they have carriages, and there's guards, and fancy dresses, and all kinds of stuff, because the monarch has the money. Where's the monarch get the money? The people, right? Taxes. That's why we don't have a monarch, because we said, you're not going to tax us without us having a voice, so get out of here. So when you think about the monarch, the two things it seems to me that kind of sit in that place of the monarch are wealth and power. If you don't have the power, you don't get to stay the monarch. And if you don't have the wealth, you don't have the influence that helps you stay in that place. Now, we don't generally, in our current time, have whole lots of kings that have that absolute kind of power, but we do have leaders that do. Sometimes we call them an autocrat, sometimes we call them a dictator, sometimes we do call them a king. Have you ever seen one of them step away from power and just give it up? No. So whatever it is that gets you into that place of being the king or the queen, whatever it is that gets you into that power and that wealth, that's kind of just who you are. But then that position begins to probably shape you in some other ways, to where you really like having carriages that drive you around, and you really like having servants that feed you your meals, and you don't really want to give all of that up. And if you look back at human history, how often have wars been fought by monarchs trying to get more territory and more land, or to protect what they do have? And the kingdoms have boundaries. Part of a monarch's job is to mind those boundaries. Even today, with the Queen of England, part of what her role is to remind those people, this is who we are. And there are other people that are not who we are, maybe. And to draw those boundaries and remind people of all of that. Now, all of this is in the Bible, too. If you read through the Hebrew Scriptures, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Chronicles, all in there is the monarchy of Israel. So they started off with, who was the first king? Saul. And then all of a sudden, David is starting to get popular, and Saul doesn't like that, right? So now there's a competitor, and so it gets kind of intriguing. Well, then David becomes the king, and when David is dying, then all of a sudden his kids start fighting over who gets to be the king, and Solomon ends up winning out. But when Solomon dies, there's another fight, and then it ends up splitting the kingdom. So the Hebrew Scriptures, the story of the people of Israel, is not a smooth one with monarchy. And as they go along, there are some kings who it is who they are to be a good king, and they do a good job. But most of them do a terrible job because it's not who they are. They don't do it well. And all of this happens in this little patch of land that is surrounded by other kings, emperors, who want that patch of land because it's a good trade route, and there's all kinds of resources that you can pass through there. And so when you read through Scripture, if you read the whole thing, you hear about the Egyptians, and then later you hear about the Assyrians, and then you hear about the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and eventually you get to the Romans, which tells you that the history of human monarchy and kingship and absolute power is one of constant fighting, and trying to take what is someone else's, and trying to gather it all up in one place for the one that has the power. So all of this to me is important as we hear Jesus say, when the Son of Man comes into his glory and sits on his throne, and the king gathers all of the peoples before him and separates out the sheep on the one side and the goats on the other, and says to them, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me. When I was sick, you took care of me. When I was a prisoner, you visited me. When you hear all of that, that does not sound like, if you heard all that, understanding everything about monarchs, you would say, well, wait a minute, I don't remember seeing the king's carriage go by. I don't remember the king stopping by for dinner. I don't remember seeing the king roaming around naked in the streets and putting clothes on him. I don't remember any of that happening, because that's not how our human monarchy works. And likewise, the ones who didn't do it would be thinking the same things, like, I don't remember not doing, skipping something that the king or the queen was going by him. So when Jesus tells this story and talks about this, it's a total upending of what you would expect in terms of where you would see the monarch. Where would you see that king or queen? So then he has to turn to them and say, well, I was there when you didn't do it for the least of these. When you skip past the poor people and the people on the fringes and the ones that don't have the power and don't have the authority, the ones that have nothing. That's where I meet you. That is not what we expect from a king or a queen in our sort of earthly way of understanding that. And Jesus then has totally upended that. And what I find fascinating about this story is that neither group gets it. It's not like the ones who did all of the feeding and the giving people something to drink and clothing them and welcoming the strangers and taking care of the sick people. It's not like they were sitting there and said, oh, geez, there's Jesus, we better go take care of all of this stuff. Which means they probably just did it because that's who they are. They were people who were generous of spirit and generous of heart, and they took care of the people around them that needed to be taken care of because that's just what you do. Which means that the ones who didn't do it because it's not who they are. Who they are is people who think, gosh, I only have so much and I probably shouldn't share because I might run out. And gosh, that stranger person that speaks a different language, that's a little bit of a threat. That's not part of our little kingdom here that we got going on, so I should keep that person at a distance. And you can work your way through the whole list and see where if you were suspicious and afraid and anxious all the time and didn't trust that there was a bigger God that was taking care of you, how you would not see Jesus in those places. But the other ones didn't either, which tells us that if we spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out who's in and who's out and which person reflects Jesus and which one doesn't, we're probably going to get it wrong because we're never going to see all of that. So then what can we learn from this story? Well, I think what Jesus is perhaps telling us is what it looks like to be just who you are when just who you are is shaped by Jesus. Because if you think about his journey, he came amongst us in a palace? No. Where? In a manger behind an inn, right? So he did not come in that place of power. And then he walks around the world. He's got a little bit of a parade with him all the time. But is it a parade of wealthy, powerful people? No, it's a parade of people that need help and mercy. And when you hear Jesus talk about the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, it's because he just is always out roaming around. When he sends the disciples out and he tells them, don't take an extra tunic and don't take an extra pair of shoes, just go, he's not telling them to do something that he hasn't already done. So when Jesus comes, he does exactly what he is. He lives faithfully in the world, he serves the people around him, and he gives of himself over and over and over again until he ends up to that place of trial and that cross. And there you see that kingship and that earthly human being coming together in this place where he has every opportunity to exercise his power, his divine power. Pilate looks at him and says, "You're a king, are you?" And he's like, "Well, you say that I am." But then he has to explain to Pilate that his kingdom doesn't work the same way. And then when he's on the cross, he's taunted, and they're like, "If you're all that powerful, why don't you get yourself down?" So he has that opportunity to use that power, but he gives it up. Human monarchs don't do that, right? Because that power is comfortable. But he gives that power up in that moment and goes into that place of death, knowing that there will be a different kind of life on the other side. A life for all of us that is new and resurrected. And so if Jesus goes and does all of that because that's just who he is, I think this story is an invitation for us to enter into journeys where Jesus can transform us to be the people that can give and live and serve in this world because that's just who we are. I'm mindful of the people that are my own faith heroes. And if I close my eyes, I can see their faces and just remember the stories and experiences that I had with them. And if I had to pick one adjective that would describe all of them, being different people as they are, I think that adjective would be generous. And I don't mean simply generous as in like financially generous, which is I think how we often understand that word, though that is certainly part of it, and all of them are. But I mean it in a broader sense. They are people, every one of them, who are generous of spirit. They're the kind of people when you sit and visit with them, you don't get a sense that they have someplace else to be. You know that, right? Like you've talked to people and you feel like they got somewhere else they're going and they're just trying to get out of the conversation with you. These are people who are generous of spirit to say, I am with you right now, making space for you and here with you. They are generous with their time. They're the kind of people you feel like you're taking way too much of their time, but they never tell you you're taking too much of their time, right? And they would never ever let on that you might be, even if it is a huge inconvenience, because they're generous with it and it doesn't really matter to them because they're there with you in that space. They're generous with forgiveness and with grace. They're the kind of people that if you've hurt them or wronged them and you kind of try to make amends, they're just like, it's going to be okay, right? This is what happens when people are people. And they live in that space and make space for others to grow and to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes and to be transformed as we go along into the people maybe that God created us to be. That kind of just generosity as a person is just who they are. Were they always that way? I would bet at some point they were a 2-year-old with a toy and someone looked at it and what did they say? Mine. Right? They started off like we all do, a little kid saying, that is mine. And then the other word they said was, no. So that's where we all started off, and somehow they ended up at the other end of this journey, thinking that really nothing is really theirs, and that their whole life is one to be shared with others in service and in living faithfully and in giving to other people, and that is where they find joy. Now something happened in between those two places, and I think what happened was Jesus showed up and just sort of turn by turn change them. And I was mindful then this week thinking about what Martin Luther says and reflecting on Paul, that we are all perfectly free, subject to none, which means we don't have a king that is going to be one we have to bow down and be subject to. But then he says we are perfectly slaves, subject to all. Right? So the freedom that we have as Christians is the freedom not to just be in charge and say that's mine and say no and live in that space of power and wealth, but to live in that space of serving others, and giving to others, and living for others. Now, the trick in the story that Jesus tells us is, we won't ever see, maybe, where God is at work in that sometimes. And if that's where we spend all of our time trying to just be holy enough and just do the sacred things, we're probably going to miss it. Because both sides of this group didn't get what was happening. Which tells me that the best thing we can probably do is just be obedient as best we can to what Jesus calls us to do. And a lot of that is pretty clear and simple. Feed hungry people. Clothe naked people, forgive your neighbor, love your neighbor as yourself. Some of that's challenging, but all of that, when Jesus tells us to do it, we might just find that when we get into those places, Jesus is already there to meet us there. The earthly monarch leads their armies out and they tax people and they expect things from people, but Jesus meets us in brokenness and service and giving and in living. We've heard some stories this month as we've focused on stewardship of people who went someplace to serve and they were afraid at first. But then they encountered the people that were there and it started to change them a bit and they found joy in that serving and value in what they did. And I think that's Jesus just making one more turn, right? Turning us from those little ones that say lying and no into the people that are generous and serve and live for the faith and gift that we have been given of life. So my hope for us as we continue this journey of faith together is that we can understand that just as monarchs are raised up and trained to be who they are in that role, that we understand that we are the people of God and that Jesus is always working on us, transforming us so that we can be people that transform the world with generosity of spirit and generosity of heart and generosity of life, because that's just who we are. Amen.